Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Rambling About AI. And look, I've even got a little graphic I made here with ChatGPT, kind of Matrix style. So that's just showing my age, obviously, because, Matrix was around, what was it, 99? I think Matrix
Oh, it
came
was a
out.
while back, yeah.
Matrix. It's kind of cool. Anyway, I like the green. I still actually have my terminal is still green. My iTerm, I have it as like the little green font. Anyway, so today in Rambling About AI, we're going to ramble on about privacy. So there's been kind of a bit of a topic over the last few weeks with Claude now Moltbot, now uh, OpenClaw. Have they
Uncloned.
decided on that now? Um, so yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about privacy concerns, and yeah, we're just going to ramble and see what comes out, basically. So yeah, where do we start? You remember we talked about that? You mentioned the triangle or the pyramid of death or something. You want to talk about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. So it's something came up as we started looking at how do you expose agents the ability to do more things. And I'd have to look up the name of the guy that coined the term. But the idea was if you exposed agents to sensitive information, uncontrolled input, therefore the risk of prompt injection attacks, and then the ability to communicate with the outside world, that you kind of had to operate at that point under the assumption that if it knew about your secrets, it could leak them and sort of approach your security model from that way. But I think what people found as they started to think about those rules is that's generally what you want them to do. And that's where Claude, OpenClaw, came out and said, look, this is just what it's going to do. It's going to do all these things that we've said it shouldn't be able to do. And I think that then started a lot of questions about where the responsibility lies for.
I remember when I installed it, the first thing it said was like, "Hey, just so you know, there's a big old disclaimer. Like we can have access to your documents, and we're gonna like you're giving us control. You're signing away any liability here on our part for doing stuff to your computer."
Yeah,
And I
well,
was just like, "Yeah, sure, go on, how about it?"
I mean, if you were a smart developer, you'd put that disclaimer amongst just about anything you did, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean you've abdicated responsibility for controlling the risk.
Yeah, I mean, it was limited to the directory that Claudebot was installed in. I mean, basically my home directory, right? And I mean, that was really the limit to what it had. And I remember that every time I tried to access, like, I don't know, my downloads folder or my photos or whatever, it would say the Mac would say, you sure you want to give grant access to this? So um, unless it had some kind of like backdoor way of getting around that, then I'm still essentially giving it control. I'm giving it access to things on my computer.
Yeah, you're opening the door for it to explore for itself. And even those safeguards, I mean, there's been a lot of work done trying to create harnesses and orchestration environments to allow these agents to operate separately. But Mac has a pretty good, just in general, isolation mechanism for apps like this. It's just kind of a once you say yes, it's got everything. You don't get kind of fine grained control, or even if you do, you're relying on the agent's continued adherence to its instructions to follow
Yeah.
those, which is the prompt injection was.
So, I mean, what would you say to people like? Because I mean, we're technical. We understand like installing what's it called, OpenClaw now on our computers. We understand about that kind of stuff. We know kind of have a vague idea of what it's going to do and all that kind of thing. What would you say to someone who's being told? What was the one that came out from Claude that was a bit more Claude Claude not Claude Claude Copilot? No,
Cowork.
Claude Cowork.
Or
That one was, I think, a bit more accessible to people that maybe don't have so much technical ability. Has maybe more of a sort of a personal assistant type feel to it. I'm gonna look at it actually today and have a play with it. But maybe something that's a bit more accessible like that for your normal person. What would you say to them in terms of like how what agents can do in terms of privacy?
I mean, the flippant answer is don't. I mean, you have to understand to give people powerful tools, right? That they're going to use it in kind of unexpected ways. And you saw it. You see a similar disclaimer on the cowork stuff. Don't use this as information. Don't use it to communicate. But at the same time, it's publicly being positioned as something that can do that. And so you're really then looking at every individual person to say, I know that this is a huge security risk, but a company like an Anthropic is saying this is something that you should do. And how do I reconcile those two things? And I think that's something where the more sophisticated you are able to approach it, the more comfortable you should be using that. But I wouldn't recommend my parents to install uh, Cowork and just start using it for all their personal things because the guardrails just aren't there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you seen it used in the AI context like that yet? Because you can kind of envision it just iterating on a design for a while and then trying to
Yeah.
find a better solution.
I mean, one thing I noticed was interesting because, like we're talking about like context within it being allowed into certain folders. So like what my experience of maybe sort of a privacy concern was when I was I was building a product project in my sites directory. I put all my projects into a sites directory, and for somehow it managed to find another project in the sites folder. So it kind of went back, it recursed, I went recursed back and then into another one to find something. So that was interesting. And had access to that, so I was able to do it. But I thought that was quite interesting. Another thing I tried had it do is I had it clone itself to another folder because we were open sourcing a project. Remember, we did a clone and then we created a copy of it.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting that it's you kind of assume it's just going to sit. The agent is going to just sit inside this directory that the site is running in, the application is running in. But it can actually recurse and go back out. And how far back out? I'm assuming it's only the folder that your home folder.
Yeah.
But that kind of is the question is like, okay, how much pressure does it have? We don't know what its power is unless we ask it to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you see all sorts of examples even from earlier on when people trying to navigate this waters where it would just break out if it thought that's what it was supposed to do. If you look at Cursor now, by default, you'll sort of see it go, try to do a thing, and then it'll say, "Oh, no, the sandbox said I can't do that," and it'll say, "Break out of the sandbox." Like, what's the point of sandbox if it can trivially break it out? And if it's a setting, which it's a setting, say whether you want to allow it to break out or not, like, why is it aware of that setting? Why doesn't it just say, "Well, I can't do that," because you
this
know,
is a good example of this is, and this is a little hack as well, a little trick if you guys are developers, product builders. So we were working on a project, and Philip was handling the back end, the API, and I was handling the front end, which is probably the right way of doing things. And we were kind of trying to silo our work. And we know that what the agents that we both use agents, obviously, and we know that they will go ahead and vibe. I hate using that word. Vibe a feature or something on an endpoint and just go ahead and build it. But we're both like, look, you don't mess with my Tish, and I won't mess with your Tish, and you will get along nicely. And the way we did that was rather than having a separate like repository for the API and a separate repository for the front end, we had it in the same repo, but we used a cursor ignore file. So dot cursor ignore. It's a cool little trick. You've probably all heard of that, of course, but I hadn't heard of it until this recent project we did. And all we did was put slash, well, it wasn't slash, it was just API into the cursor ignore file, and then it didn't know about it, and we were able to work, and no changes were made. It would actually say, "I don't see an API folder. I don't see any. Where's your backend?" And then you had to explain to the agent that it's hidden in the file, and say, "Okay, I won't mess with that." And then that's how we work. But later on down the project, I think you went around or something, and I knew there was one. Maybe you said, "Oh, you just need to change the endpoint." I was like, well, "Okay, well, I took the API folder out of the cursor ignore file, and then it made the change to the endpoint, which was okay because you knew exactly what it was doing. I knew it was going to be messing with that API folder, messing with that endpoint. And then I obviously checked it with you and we were fine. But it's just interesting, isn't it, that you have that cursor ignore file and the agent has no idea about it if you have it in there. If you take it out, it'll just go ahead and say, "Oh, I see in the API," and go for it. So in that sense, that's a privacy thing, really, when you're talking about building products with, you know, back ends and front ends.
well, anytime you're trying to draw a line between everything the agent could possibly access and then what it can access, you have to think about how bright that line is. The cursor ignore files works for Cursor. It seems to understand that it's not supposed to access things. It'll actively refuse to do it. Um, so, when we were experimenting with how do you do this co-development with more than one person in the same repo, where we're both using essentially the same vibe coding tools, knowing that unless you very, very carefully fence them off from each other, they will step on each other's toes all day long without even really realizing. Almost like you have two different agent windows open in the same application. And so using a different cursor ignore file on each one of our computers to isolate those folders, you can imagine someone trying to take a similar approach to their personal information, saying, look, you know, I don't want you to be able to access this file that has my financial information and my social security number information and things like that. And, you know, would a motivated AI really be able to get that anyway? Could it create a symlink that goes to it, which names the file something different so it doesn't appear that way?
Well, I was going to say, would we're talking about Cursor, right? And we both use Cursor, but
As an example.
what about Claude Code? I mean, Claude Code, does it have it? Doesn't obviously doesn't read a cursor ignore file. If you said to Claude Code, "Hey, this endpoint's not working," it would go ahead and say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll fix it in the API." There must be a sort of a cursor ignore file in Claude Code. I'm not familiar so much, but
I think a lot of these patterns get propagated through the tools over time. So the idea that you need to isolate a part of your code base at one point in time is kind of baked in all of them, different syntax, right? From the git ignore is sort of the classic one. It's like, don't check into the repo, they're used for secrets and things. That's a good place to start. But then, like I said, when you're intentionally trying to develop on both sides at the same time, co-develop it, you want a way to create some sort of isolation. And I remember we struggled a lot early on with how to do that. Do we have different repos? Do we have folders in the repo? Do we just accept the fact that it's all working together? But I think the more you can compartmentalize it in terms of the amount of code that it's dealing with at any given time, that seems to be a big predictor of how successful it is. And so isolating parts of the code base in order to reduce its context seems like a good move. And you can propagate that same thought process into your personal information. It's probably just
yeah,
a good idea anyway.
I was just about to say that. Like we're talking very much like as from a development product building perspective right now, but like for someone who's maybe not a developer or building products, they might ask the same. I'm just trying to put myself in their shoes. They might ask the same questions like, okay, so if I have an agent and I don't want them to access certain things, would it be like I create a file that says, don't mess with this folder, don't mess with this, don't mess with this. But then I can imagine them saying, okay, so if I create that file and tells the agent what they can't mess with, what's to stop the agent just editing that file and saying, I'm going to go ahead and just edit it? So I think that's really maybe the concern that people are having is like, how much power, like, how do you stop an agent potentially doing whatever it wants to do? I
I
mean,
mean, the basic premise now seems to be Docker based or container based, sort of network isolation. Yeah, a mounted folder that only lets things into it. Docker's not perfect at isolating.
and Docker, for those that don't know, is a sort of a simulated virtual environment, right? A virtual computer within your machine.
Yeah, container technology. There's a number of them that have kind of sprung up that are operating a similar way, but isolating it from the network, isolating it from sensitive information, creating like a safe space for it to kind of do whatever it wants to, and then find other ways to allow it to communicate with the outside world, like passing files back and forth and things like that. Um, I've used that approach at a few clients that I've talked to say, you know, you can let it do its thing, but you have to control the data goes in and you have to control the data goes out of it. And you're counting on it to sort of work in the middle, thinking that it's, doing what it's doing. But when it thinks it sent an email, it didn't. It made a draft somewhere, something like that, where you're kind of controlling what actually goes in and out of it.
I think there's quite a level of trust that we give these big companies like, OpenAI, Anthropic, especially Anthropic, because they're doing a lot of work with agents right now. We kind of trust that, all that prompting that goes behind the scenes that we don't see, that we obviously have our prompts, but then the agents have all their prompts that are behind
Mhm.
that. Like we're trusting that they're not out to get us, but well, are they out to get us? You know what I mean? So like, there's a lot of level of trust in that we trust that they're not going to do anything to destroy our computers or collect personal information or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you remember back originally when ChatGPT came out and it really started to get popular, there was a lot of early concern about that because the reason they put it out there wasn't because it was a commercial product. The reason they put it out there was like a test. And so the idea was they would use the conversations that we were having with the bot to train the bot and sort of allow it to improve. And as like a research approach, that sounds great. But then they realized people started using it and giving it lots of very personal information that almost you don't want to use to train the models, right? It's not that helpful. So that's when then the policy changed. And it was like, well, if you're paying, we won't use your information to train it. And so that creates a little bit of a filter then to say,
Well, they
here's how
say
you
they're not using that
pay
data.
for privacy. I mean, usually what you can trust, usually, this has been disproven over and over again, but usually, if a company comes out and says explicitly they are not doing something and they are large enough that someone may be held accountable for that, they're probably not doing it. If they don't say whether they're doing it or not, they probably are doing it. Otherwise, they say they would do it.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on like when AI first uh, came out, well, not when OpenAI started really pushing ChatGPT. What was you know, give us a little bit of a history on how that you touched on it, but like originally we had the models that needed training. There's original, what do you call them?
A foundation
Found
model.
Yeah, well, founders is fair. And then they needed training data, so people were accepting that they would train, and they were happy to do that and volunteering. And then as the models grew, as they became more intelligent, they learned more. It got to the point where they could be used by the consumer, the end user, and they were still training. I'm assuming. I mean, you talk us through what how that worked.
Yeah, for a period of time, everybody's trying to figure this out. I mean, the leap from again, unless you're in OpenAI, you don't really know the nitty-gritty here, but the leap from, like, ChatGPT 2, which is kind of previous to all this, to 3 and 3.5 when it really became a consumer product, uh, a lot of that advancement was driven by reinforcement learning from using humans experimenting with it. So
And people that consented.
people they consented to it, people they were paying to do it, right? I mean, the Scale AI started doing a lot of this kind of stuff, and, they were specifically training it on as a pure foundation model, it's just predicting the next token without any real sense of how it's supposed to be doing it. And then you train it with the human feedback to get it to talk more like a human, to have a natural start and a natural end. And in that mode, that training was very valuable. And so as you saw that kind of steadily improving from 3 to 3.5 to 4 to 4.5 and continued away, that reinforcement learning was a big part of that. And so the ability to capture more or less real text was how I got trained. What's interesting about that though is, and you probably got this sense of once companies start kind of giving up on this, is that the low hanging fruit just from random chat conversations is probably gone. Now it's probably much more into um, uh, applications that are more domain based, right? So you see OpenAI and these companies hiring legal experts and financial modeling experts and Excel experts and people who are going to apply it in particular domains because now the gap is, well, it doesn't know how to analyze a spreadsheet, it doesn't know how to analyze this, doesn't know, it's not that it can't carry on a conversation. So I think the value of the casual conversation that you're having with it has probably gone down, and now it's more about how much domain knowledge you're putting into
But
it.
in terms of privacy, though, I was thinking about consent. That's what I was touching on. Really, is like there must have been a shift at some point when they'd learned enough. These models had learned enough to be useful and to be do what they wanted to do, where consent wasn't. You didn't need people to train it. It was like there was a point where you could say, I don't want to give you my data. I don't want you to learn from me because I'm concerned about my privacy and, all the stuff that I'm going to tell you. Right. And they could say, sure, at that point. Right. So there must have been a point when they had enough to be able to say that. You mentioned like being people paying and stuff like that. So I guess the people that are paying then because they have access to everyone else's training work that they've done before.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually a nice bargain. I kinda like the model. If you're there was the old adage that if you're not the customer, you're the product. So, if you're using it for free, you're paying by providing the training data, and if you're paying for it, you're by definition not. It's very similar to the way advertising model works, is you're paying them by consuming the products and getting and the company's reaching a benefit for that. So, you see these kind of shifts where the threat to privacy, the idea that sort of random chats are including personal information and that personal information should be used to train the model, that that sort of changes over time as that type of data becomes less valuable incrementally, then there's less of a need to kind of incentivize it. And therefore you start to see restrictions on the free tier and more push toward paid and just kind of a model to go, all right, now we need to capture value from this thing instead of just being focused on training it better and better, because clearly just continually training it better and better has hit a point of diminishing returns. And now it's about how you monetize. And that question of, every company out there early on, don't use ChatGPT because you're leaking our personal information, our sensitive information, privacy in the enterprise context, right? Business information. And that is still a thing that people say, even though the days of ChatGPT training on, the basic plans is long, long gone. But that adage still lives out there. Don't tell it anything because they're going to use to train it,
Yeah.
even though the incentives really aren't there anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of things, topics that could come out of this. Like I know just then I was thinking about I remember watching this YouTube interview with some creatives, some writers. They were concerned because they all this published works that they'd done. You know, they'd obviously invested their lives writing these things, and then they copyright them, and they expect to get royalties. They expect to have permission before they're published. Well, the AI is just ingesting all this date, all these books and everything, and essentially just reusing them, spitting things out, using them for training data and all this kind of stuff. And these people are quite rightfully upset that their work is just being absorbed and potentially used without any, references, without any. So it's kind of like, I mean, it's sort of in the privacy, maybe in the same camp, but these big companies are just going in and doing this, and it's just like nothing stops them. And obviously, people are getting their feathers ruffled.
Yeah, I mean, time that you think your work is being reused or your personal information is being used in a way you didn't expect, it's gonna kinda, like, trigger something. I think the idea that ingesting copyrighted materials and what happens about it, it was a really interesting article. I'll find it so we can link to it, but we're sort of talking about how in the ways that they tried to solve this, none of them seem to work because the idea of copyright, when applied in this context, just doesn't fit that well. It was sort of designed behind the idea that producing copyrightable works was hard and was unique and distinct. And so once you did it, it needed to be protected. And originally, it was the fixed form of it, like the book itself, the paper, the pages. And we sort of started to apply that in digital context and it worked for a while. But now it's kind of breaking down. One of the hypotheticals from that article, which I thought was fascinating, was what if every time you go to a news website, you're not seeing an article they wrote, but you're seeing a manifestation entirely for you of just based on other things that you've read and things that you've talked about. It's rewriting the article, like just for your consumption. What's copyright on that?
Mm. And this actually touches, that goes back to our, what we're talking about agents, agent experiences, because essentially that's an agent going in, grabbing data, and then providing it to you. But the agent has to have a good experience. That's our last topic that we talked about, but it
Yeah,
does relate somewhat.
yeah. I think it's puts an interesting spin on it when we try to take these ways of approaching problems, ways of approaching privacy, ways of approaching copyright, and then move them into this age where content generation is trivial, when they're all based on the idea that content generation is hard and you can control the generation, and therefore you control the distribution, and therefore you control the problem. But now the distribution is nothing and the content generation is nothing. And all of these things are just so trivial now that the law can't really keep up with it. Extreme personalization was not a thought when they designed
Do you think they'll
copyright.
change? Do you think they'll change laws around copywriting and that kind of thing? Do you think they'll change?
I mean, I think it'll have to adjust somehow, if not just because there'll be so many lawsuits over it. New York Times still has their lawsuit. Wall Street Journal, I think, has one. Individual people who are pushed in different directions are bringing it in. And even early on, you remember the OpenAI came out and had addressed this version of copyright early on and said, no, when you generate something through our models, you own the copyright for that. They sort of transfer the copyright to you as part of the terms of use. One way to think about that is, oh, that's very generous of them to give you the copyright for all your work for free. Another interpretation was that that's how you kind of dodge the issue, right? Is we're not claiming copyright over the works based on the fact that we copyrighted it. It's our user. And so they're sort of pushing the responsibility down onto you to make sure that what you produced doesn't trigger somebody else's copyright. So I think they found enough of a gray area to keep going, but gray areas have a way of coming less gray when this much money is involved. And you're definitely seeing that play out in the courts.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, early on, and we were talking about how we just accept, like I think as developers, we kind of have a bit more of acceptance because we kind of understand a little bit more about what's going on. And we understand that kind of context about like siloing your folders. But what about like, maybe older people who, like we talked about that a bit earlier, like, do you think that the younger people that are coming into this now, they just have ChatGPT on the phone? So ChatGPT is a part of life. It's like people search, when we were growing up, it's like, yeah, the internet was just a thing you used, right? And we trusted it. Do you think that now, like kids are coming in, ChatGPT, oh yeah, I'm going to upload stuff to it. They kind of by default accept and consent to giving it information because it's just a part of the way of the world right now. Whereas maybe older people that have seen this evolution are maybe a little bit more concerned. I mean, for example, I have an example of that because I was working. I've been trying to launch a new app, and the app basically takes transcripts from meetings and tries to create content based on those meetings. Someone that I was chatting to, potential customer, was saying he's concerned about having a meeting, a client or whatever, and then that meeting having sensitive information and then going into the application. And I was like, well, we strip all that kind of stuff. We make sure that client names are taken out, and we do a run through of the transcript to make sure there's nothing sensitive in there first before it goes in as a source. But he was saying, well, I want to screen it before it even gets to that point. I was thinking about it in my head. I was like, well, we can't because it comes to us and then we have to store it and then we process it, right? So it's almost like just you then trusting the model it goes into. Do you know what I'm saying? So like the Zoom meeting he has, that transcript already being saved by Zoom or, you know, wherever they've taken that meeting, and it's going into a digital format and then it's being read by AI and being summarized. So I guess he's trusting Zoom, he's trusting these big corporations, and maybe it's just he doesn't trust a small company. So does it just boil down to having good privacy statements and legal kind of, CO, SO, SOC 2 or whatever, you know, compliance?
I think if you
There's a lot of questions in there. I know.
Yeah, no, but I think if you ask that question, like, when a company's thinking about their legal protections, that's generally as far as I go. If you think about it ethically or as a member of an ecosystem that's working on these tools, I think the way you design the user experience has a big part in that. You should make it more difficult to share your personal information with a tool like this than not to do so. I mean, you get to make choices all the time when you're designing a user experience to steer people towards behavior you do or don't want. There's famous studies on how to position choices in ways that push people one way or another, and a lot of that energy in the web space is being spent on how do you trick people to sign up? How do you get them to do loot boxes? How do you sort of take advantage of these, psychological characteristics to drive toward monetary behaviors? And I think if you took that same approach and thought about it from a privacy standpoint of how do we encourage people to have privacy behaviors, you could get a lot more progress on it. But it's something you have to consciously choose, and you need to employ somebody like yourself that's really thinking through that kind of thing.
But these people, the younger folk, they're just going in and trusting and accepting. Do you think that they're going to be worse off than the people that are older who are making sure that the companies do adhere to certain privacy?
Are they gonna be worse off? That's a good question. I mean, your life is a moving window over a particular time period,
Yeah.
right? And, like, your experience in that is gonna be different than somebody whose time period started before. So, you'll always see this just based on the fact that I've been alive longer than somebody who's 20 years old. I've been negatively impacted by my personal information leaking. Somebody that's 20-year-old might not have. And so unless you have that moment, it never really triggers in you to say, you need to care about this. And that's true for every generation that goes through this kind of a thing. That people that grew up with mobile phones native don't think a lot about. It knows where you are all the time. That was never a thing that we would have thought would be normal with a computer that was going to track you all the time. But now it's fun. So whether or not they're better off, entirely different question than the inevitability of, like, whatever we position now as normal is a self-fulfilling prophecy for what will be normal in the future. And right now, it's don't think about your personal information. Don't think about your privacy. Look how cool this agent is. And it's cool. It's just, I don't think it's cool enough that the idea of privacy goes out the window.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like, I mean, this is a huge topic. I think we've just been touching on it, and we realize there's so much that we're talking about in these. There's so much to unpack. Specifically towards agents, though, kind of reining it in to agents. Um, do you think it's okay to just trust these agents and let them do their thing?
I think I think you have to be comfortable with more of an agentic nature than you would have used to be. When this all first came out, it was like, no, I'm going to check every line of code that it writes. Then you kind of start to develop well, not check every line of code. I only need to check, you know. So the heuristics that come out as we start to work with these things are going to drive you in whichever direction your personal experience kind of pushes you. But it's hard to find a balance because if that sort of triangle of death told us nothing, is that
We didn't
the
even talk
very
about death.
well,
Did
yeah,
we
so
really even?
it's come up, I forget who coined it, but it's the idea that, as you put these different pieces together, you give it access to email, you give it the ability to talk to the internet, and you give it this sort of unconstrained input that comes with prompt injection, is it can just communicate all your information to the outside world. And the paradox there is that is both the absolute riskiest thing you could possibly do with it, but it is also the use case everybody wants to use it for. They wanna use it so I can say, "Send Stu an email with an idea for the podcast next week," and it'll just do that, right, without me doing anything, but at the same time, it's the riskiest thing you could possibly do with it. And so as long as those 2 things are diametrically opposed, we're gonna be in this weird world where you see people pushing forward while everyone else is going, "Yeah, that's not a good idea, though."
Yeah, I think you said the right word earlier. It was balance. Balance.
Yeah,
And there's a
there's a
line, isn't there's a benefit to using these things because it's going to save you time and it's going to be pretty cool. Like, and then there's the whole, I don't care about my time being saved. I actually care more about my privacy. I'm just not going to use agents at all. So I mean, really, what is the benefit of an agent? What is it actually doing? Ultimately, it's probably mostly saving time.
it's saving time. Yeah, I mean, if you're using it to overcome a skills deficit, then you should probably work on your skill, right? If you're not a good writer, you're using ChatGPT to write, you should probably become a better writer. If you're using it to make you faster, then that's the way you should be thinking about it. I can do that. Yeah, if I never do it again, I'll lose my practice. And so that's a fair sort of criticism of this approach. But in any micro sense, it's not going to hurt me to have GPT write an email. And if it can write it in a minute and a half behind the scenes while I'm doing something else, then I'm gonna use it to do that. It's a time saving. But the tools themselves don't know how you're using it. They don't know whether they're being used as a time saving or to overcome a skills gap. So you have to be the one to put that layer over it and consciously use it in a way that's gonna save you time and not try to be your brain,
Mm.
like a lot of people think when they look at something like that.
So to wrap up, like, if you don't remember anything else in this podcast, like, I would say the person that comes in, they say, I want to use an agent because I want to save time. I am concerned about my privacy, but I'm willing to do certain things, so that I can get the benefits of the agent. They want to use Claude, OpenClaw, or they want to use Claude, the other one we talked about.
Claude Cowork.
Cowork, thank you. Or whatever it is they want to use, they do want to do that. What would you say is the maybe three things that they should be conscious of before they sign that disclaimer with Anthropic and say, yes, go ahead and dive into my computer? What would you say, like two or three things that these people should bear in mind before they do that?
So I'll do one thing because this is my favorite.
Okay,
This is my
fine.
favorite piece of advice to give people, right? And I'll also look right in the camera and do it. Don't use these tools. Don't use them. There's way too much privacy risk. There's way too much security. Like we have not solved the problem of prompt injection where your AI agent can have access to unconstrained input like emails coming in and the ability to access your information and email it to somebody else. Like we have not solved that problem. You should not use these tools. Then again, if you hear me say that and think, no, you're stupid, I know how to do this, fine. If you know how to control for it, you're more than welcome to do it. But if you don't. It's a very simple answer unless you're really, really sure you know exactly what to do. And that's gonna make it much more likely you're gonna be able to protect yourself from the downside.
So we're just going to just delete this podcast because I think really that's the ultimate. That's the solution. Is just don't use the tools.
Don't unless you know how to do it, in which case fine. But don't.
Yeah. I would say, be aware. Be very aware of what you're doing. Like study, research, look at what it's doing, understand. And as you say, like if you have any concerns or any doubts, don't do it. Um, yeah.
Every rule has exceptions. And the definition of the exception is you really understand the rule, then you can have exceptions. So the rule is no, not
Yeah.
yet.
And I also would recommend people check out the we call it the triangle of death.
Yeah, triangle death, pyramid death. It's had
That's
a couple of names. We'll put a link in the
Yeah,
show
that's a
stuff.
that's a good thing to read about. I think you sent me an article once about that. It was pretty cool to read.
Yeah.
So yeah. All right. Well, that summarizes it. We're at 34 minutes, and the moral of the story is don't use these agents, according to Philip. And no, but that was great, and I'm sure we can do a part two of this because this is all evolving as well. We're learning. That's the great thing about this podcast. Is every week there's something new to talk about because it's evolving every week. Opus 5.3, no 4.6, no 4.6 just
4.6,
came out. I
yeah.
don't even know what model number is because I can't keep up. 4.6 came out this week, and apparently it's amazing, of course, and mind blowing. Everyone's minds are always getting blown every week. And then also we had ChatGPT 5.3 come
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
It's just everything's happening so quickly. But yeah, be careful out there, guys.
Yeah, and, I'm gonna go spin up OpenClaw and plug it in,
Yeah.
send some emails.
Thanks,
Alright,
everyone.
see you guys.
Peace.